So we are recording these sessions because we've been asked about it a lot, and so finally I'm glad that we're able to do this. And these are available on our YouTube page, but our YouTube page is a little we're still working through it, and so the best way to get to these is to go to the newsletter, and there's one button in there, and you can press it, and and you'll go straight to all the previous recordings. And as always, most of y'all are muted, but a couple of y'all aren't. If you're not muted, if something happens in the background, if you have the dishwasher running or you decide to vacuum, we're going to all hear it in stereo. And so sometimes when I can hear some feedback, I come in and I'll mute you myself. But if the crowd continues to grow, it gets a little more difficult for me to notice that. And so we are tonight going to be in Mark chapter 7, the Gospel of Mark chapter 7. And as we begin tonight, just a reminder of a couple things that we talked about in the first chapter is that we believe that this gospel, it's the first gospel written. We believe it's written probably in the 60s AD. Okay. And we think tradition says that John Mark wrote this, and John Mark is an important character in the New Testament. He's one of Paul's colleagues. He's kind of an understudy. If it is written by John Mark ends up becoming sort of the protege of Peter. Peter becomes sort of, even though John Mark is with Paul, they have a bit of a falling out and then they reunite. But Peter becomes the one that John Mark really follows and models himself after. So this gospel of Mark, we think, is the preachings and teachings of Peter as written down by John Mark. Now, there's no for sure to know that, but that's what we think it is. And assuming that is the case, this would be written to, most likely, the Roman church. And if this is in the mid-60s AD, this is still a very small church, and Christianity would have been in Rome, but it's a very little thing. Both Hebrew and Christians are a very little thing, and I've not ever been to Rome. Unlike I see Polly, she's online. I think she's been to Rome many times. But apparently underneath Rome are all kinds of Jewish catacombs. There's catacombs where the Jewish church used to meet. And there's all sorts of stuff that's supposed to be under there that is supposed to be cool. And one of these days, maybe I'll be able to go and do some exploring with somebody who knows what they're talking about. But I'm saying all this because John Mark, we think, is writing this gospel to a non-Jewish audience. And the reason that that's important is that the early church, the majority of the early church were Jewish converts to Christianity, or not. I don't want to say they let go of their Jewishness, because they didn't. They were Jews who accepted Jesus Christ as the Messiah. Okay, that's going to be the majority of the church. Mark, specifically in the Gospel of Mark, he goes into detail about Jewish customs a lot, and we're going to see that coming up here in just a second. And that's why scholars say he's writing this to a non-Jewish audience. And there's all kinds of evidence that does say this should be John Mark, and this should be going to the church in Rome. So we need that little just kind of recapsule there as we begin, because it'll help some of this stuff make sense. So Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, and I'm going to start in verse 1. Now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. So in these first two verses, there's a couple of clues in here. We think that at this point in time that Jesus is in Capernaum, which is 125 miles from Jerusalem. And so if these elders of the church, or if these church authorities are indeed coming from Jerusalem, they're traveling a pretty good distance just to come see Jesus. And like most of us, when we go any distance, if we have to go anywhere outside of our area of comfort, we probably have an agenda to accomplish. If we go to, if we, for the people that live inland, they come to the beach. And so they'll come to the beach for a week and they will lather on baby oil and they will bake themselves to a nice toasty crisp over 7 days. That's the agenda. But to go back and to show everybody in middle America, I went to the beach. That's part of, and I lived there, so I know you have to show that you actually went to the beach. And so we, of course, know how the story goes that Jerusalem is going to end up being the place where Jesus loses his life. And the problems are going to really multiply and materialize there. But we're not to that point yet. Mark in 65 AD or 62 AD or 67 AD, whenever he's writing this down, he knows how the story goes, and he knows how it is planned out. So he's very, very specific about this. And this story is in other gospels, and I forgot to talk about that this morning because I have that in my notes to go back and read another gospel account. We might do that, but they noticed, these authorities from Rome, they noticed that Jesus's disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. Okay, so here's kind of the skinny of this. In the Old Testament, there are no laws that say that you have to wash your hands before you eat. Okay, even though COVID has taught us otherwise, even though we know that it's probably a good idea to wash your hands before you eat, and we've known that for a long time, there was not a law specific to that. It was a tradition of the elders. Okay, it was the tradition of the authorities, and the reason that it was a tradition of the authorities is a very good reason. In the Old Testament, when the priests or the keepers of the church are working with the altar, which would include offerings that people would bring, which would be offerings of animals and other things, which would include an offering of the temple bread, all these kind of things. There are laws for those people to wash their hands and to cleanse themselves before they get in the proximity of God's house, of the altar. And so because Hebrews, part of the Old Testament, is also that they are to be a kingdom of priests, that they are as a whole to be a house of holiness. The Jewish authorities expanded the hand washing to give the people permission to feel holy. In other words, if I see the priests washing their hands, and if they are telling me that I can wash my hands, then that makes me feel like I have not authority as much as that I have a connection to God that I may not otherwise have. Does that make sense? And so the Pharisees, who are the interpreters of the law, and the elders, they had sort of prescribed this, that if you wish to wash your hands, it is perfectly acceptable, in fact, a very holy thing. Now, those laws are given in the 1500 BC. Now, where we are talking about, where Jesus is, we're talking about 1500, almost 1600 years later. And by this time, they had elevated, the elders of the law had elevated this tradition of allowing everybody to wash to a commandment. They had made something that was not required by God to be required by God. And the reason that that's important is because if you don't do what God asks you to do, that's a sin. That's the importance of it, is that if they do not wash their hands, it is a sin. And so what in these first two verses, what we're getting to is Mark is kind of hinting to us that these people are coming from Jerusalem with not good intentions, and that as they arrive, they're probably looking for a reason to find problem with the situation. And what they see, and if you look in your scripture, is they see Jesus's disciples not washing their hands. Not Jesus, but the disciples are not washing their hands. Okay, so we could split that apart if you want. Does that mean that Jesus was washing his hands? Jesus assuming the role of the priest, that he is doing the ceremonial washing and the disciples are not? We don't know, but scholars and at least theologians, the commentaries I read did point that out, that it's interesting that Jesus is not the one called out for not washing his hands. It's the disciples. But the inference is that if the disciples are holy people, if Jesus and his group are truly holy people, they should, without a doubt, be washing their hands before they eat. And it's not about cleanliness, it's not about sanitizing. It has nothing to do with that. It's all about purifying yourself before you approach the Lord. Does that make sense? So we look at it as hand washing being that is a common sense. That's what you do so you don't get sick. You wash your hands before you eat. And that makes all the scientific sense in the world. But with what we're talking about in this scripture, it's a different thing. Okay, so there's a difference between cleanliness as far as sanitation goes and cleanliness versus purification, because purification is a whole different sort of thing. And we're going to be talking about those two things kind of throughout this chapter. We're going to see it. So take a look at.
Are you saying that cleanliness is next to godliness?
Oh, yes, that's exactly probably what I don't know. Sure. If that's what you want to say, you go right on and say it. You did. So look at your verse 3. Look at y'all's verses 3, because this is where the parentheses begin in your Bible. And this is interesting. Verse number 3, it says, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews, they do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles." Now you see how that was in parentheses? And this is, I don't want this to come out as blasphemous, but and if your study Bible has, it probably does have a little notation on it. If you look at it, it'll say that this is not true. All the Jews do not wash their hands before they eat. Why do we know that? Because the disciples are not washing their hands before they eat, and they're Jewish. We know that they're not washing their hands, and we know that there's others that are not washing these hands. It's not just these 12 that are not washing these hands. There are plenty of others who are not washing their hands before they eat. And yet John Mark is very clear to include this in the scripture, albeit in parentheses. So here's the different directions that this could go, or that this could mean. This could be that as God is inspiring John Mark, he says, open parentheses, John Mark, and then write this. And he writes a sentence, close parentheses, John Mark. He could do it. That could be true, but it's probably not the case. God probably didn't command him to use parentheses. So let's look at what's in between the parentheses. One of the things we talked about in the first class was that when our gospel, when our Bibles are being copied, the first scriptures were probably not copied by professionals. They were probably not copied by theologians. They were probably copied. Let's say John Mark writes his text. They were probably copied by a literate someone who wanted to have a copy for their family or wanted to have a copy for their friends. Does this make sense? Okay, so We know for a fact that some of our earliest texts are not written by people who are worried about accuracy. It is absolutely possible that that's where this comes from. It is absolutely possible that someone who is bending their kids backwards to make sure they wash up before they come to dinner, that they have to include this. It is also possible that because John Mark is writing this text to non-Jewish believers, and that by the time that John Mark is writing this in the first century New Testament Palestine, or that he's writing it in Rome, that Romans and Greeks were washing their hands. They already knew that you washed your hands before you ate. Scientifically, they already knew that that's just what you did. That makes sense? So if John Mark is writing this to a non-Jewish audience in the church, and he is in part trying to help people come to the faith, if Greeks and Romans who are washing very well before they eat, if they think that not washing before you eat is part of the faith, they may not do it. They may not do the faith. Why? Because everybody in their right mind knows that you wash before you eat. Right? Does that make sense? So what I'm trying to do is come up with some options, because all of your theologians, all of your study Bibles, they'll all say this. If there's a they're all saying the same sort of thing. They're saying, we know that this isn't wrong because we know that not all Jews wash their hands. And we also know that John Mark is writing this specifically to a non-Jewish audience. And this would not fly in ancient, this would not fly on first century Rome or in Greece, which is going to be most of the people that he's trying to write to. Now, it is also possible that God fully told John Mark to write these exact words. Okay. But the thing is we already know that all the Jews aren't washing their hands because Jesus' disciples aren't washing their hands. So it makes sense. So I said blasphemous. This doesn't mean that the word of God is wrong, but this certainly means that this verse in here has, you got to put a little asterisk by it, a little question mark by it, and say, it may not have happened the way exactly that it has come out to me in the year 2023. It could have been because somebody who first copied it felt like they needed to say everybody was already washing their hands. It may have been that John Mark needed to tell the Greek audience that everybody was washing their hands. Does that make sense? Okay, so,
Yes.
okay. Okay, so, yes, you can talk about it.
So, well, because I appreciate you making time to talk about why sometimes our Bibles are different and why there may be something, a nuance. Because I think sometimes people outside of the church or people who may be angry at God for whatever, valid emotion they may be experiencing, these are those things that we can get kind of stuck in the weeds about. It doesn't take away from the message of the gospel. In fact, these are the things that help us see it's true. Because if they were trying to keep an account that was perfect, they wouldn't allow little discrepancies and nuances. And so I appreciate you pointing that out, because I think a lot of times when we're new to faith, or maybe we've been in the faith since birth and not really thought about it, we don't always know how to respond to those things. And sometimes people will make an argument on that and we don't know what to do with it. But those are the things that actually help us uphold the faith. Historical documents all over the world have nuances and we accept them as truth. It's when there are those little nuances and we still publish them and accept them, that's what proves they're valid, because we're not trying to cover anything up.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And we're going to have another example here just a little bit later on in this same chapter where it happens again, to where it's like, no, wait a minute, this isn't true. This is not. But is there another reason that would be in there? Of course, there could be all kinds of reasons that it could be in there. But so that is verse 3 that we looked at. So let's look at or 3 and 4, excuse me. So let's look at verse 5. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the traditions of the elders, but they eat with defiled hands?" Okay, so what I did this morning's class, and it didn't work out too well. It worked okay, but what I tried to do is I tried to say, for example, because we are such a worldly traveling group, and we've been all over the place. So I asked the group this morning, I said, out of all the places you've been all over the world and all your vacations and all your trips, what is the best meal that you have ever had in all those places that you went? And so I'll ask y'all, all 6 of you, the same question. What is the best meal you ate somewhere else? Jeffrey, what's yours?
Reindeer in Sweden.
Oh my goodness. Reindeer in Sweden. Okay, so you have to, most of us have not had reindeer, so
they have to kill a certain number of them every winter, otherwise it's going to be chaos. So,
okay. Like
so
deer here. Yeah, like white-tailed deer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a little bit like, it's sort of a cross between deer and beef. But yummy.
So how did they prepare it, and how did you have it?
Yeah, it was roasted and had a gravy with it, with little potatoes and I think carrots, something like that. Yeah, it was nice.
Oh, that's awesome. Marita, what about you? What is the best meal you've ever had somewhere else?
I don't know how to unmute myself.
You're unmuted. You're good.
You're unmuted.
Oh, great. Oh, the biggest pot is already done. The best meal that I've ever had besides Eddie Noon's,
Whoops.
it has to be someplace else. All right, I'm gonna say Sweden too, but I'm gonna say salmon. It was the best salmon I've ever had in my whole life, and it was with mashed potatoes and peas, and it was delicious.
Okay, excellent. Okay. Anybody else want to share where their best meal? Now, Polly, I know you've been all over the world 3 times and back, but you're muted, so we can't hear you. So you have to unmute yourself if you're able to, and I can see if I can give you an option to unmute. And we've still got it's the red microphone that is
okay. Now I'm unmuted.
Okay.
I think the sushi in Japan was amazing.
No.
And then all my food in Italy, I just, I gained 50 pounds. Every restaurant I went to was fabulous. So I don't know. I've eaten some good meals all around. It was fun.
So kind of the reason that
What is yours?
What is mine?
Yeah, what's yours?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I don't know. I really like shawarma. I think shawarma is great. So when we got shawarma in the Holy Land, and then again in Egypt, shawarma is that big thing, that the big hunk of meat, swirling hunk that they just carve off and give you a big. I'm carnivore. That was good. And so the reason I brought that up is that, when we go to these places and we've had these meals and these special things, we want them to prepare food the way that they prepare food. We want them to do it the way that they do it in their culture, in their world. And it's very different than ours. We don't want to travel, to another place and have the same thing that we can have right here. It may be the same food, but we want it to be prepared the way they prepare it, served the way they prepare it, because it's different and it's part of what makes them who they are. Just like, so I'm from the South, and so I grew up on chicken fried steak and gravy. Okay. Now, all of y'all combined have not eaten as much chicken fried steak as I have. But that's how I was raised. And so when I come to a new place like Longboat Key, I just eat fish, or when I first got here for the first couple of years, I just ate fish nonstop. But when we go to those places, we want it to be the way that they want it. We want them to be who they are, because it's original to us, it's new to us, it's different to us. And that preserving that cultural those cultural norms, and keeping true to who they are, that's a big deal. That's a big deal for everybody, no matter where you are or who you are. It's important that we maintain who we are as individuals, as God created us. And that's part of what makes our experiences, when we're able to get outside of our own boundaries, what makes our experiences so special, because we're witnessing some things, we're seeing things, smelling things, tasting things that we can't do at home. And we value that different piece. And so what we're talking about here in the Gospel of Mark is, we are talking a lot about culture. What is the culture like? Because if John Mark is writing this to non-Jewish Christians in Rome, that's a very different audience than if he was in Jerusalem writing it to the church. It's a whole different context, and it's a whole different environment. The food is different, the culture is different, their habits are different. Do they wash? When do they wash? How do they wash? All kinds of things are included in that. And so cultural identity is a big deal. And most of the rules and most of the stuff that we have in the Old Testament of God coming to the Hebrew people is about the Hebrew people maintaining who they are. And that's important, because who are they? They are God's people. They're God's chosen people. The rest of the world, not so much. The rest of the world, we have to be specifically invited to get in. But the Hebrews are God's chosen people. And so to maintain their identity, their culture, who they are, what they are about, is really, really important. And Moses actually talks about that in the first 5 books of the Bible. He says, oh, all these laws, everybody is going to look at us and think we are the best in the whole world, because we have all these beautiful rules and we have these beautiful dietary habits, and everybody's going to be envious of us. And of course, they're wandering around the desert. They don't even have a place to go yet. But that's who makes them what they are. And so maintaining who they are is really, really important. And in the early church, especially now when John Mark is writing this to that young church, this is the same point in time Paul would have probably written all of his letters by now. Paul dies somewhere close to when this comes out. And if you know something about Paul's letters, you'll know that he is constantly talking to the churches about what to eat and what not to eat, because they're in constant battles with each other. Because you have people that were Jewish that are now in the Christian church, and they were raised Jewish, and they have these traditions that make them Jewish. They have these rules that make them who they are. For instance, they don't eat bacon. They don't eat pork, which I cannot fathom, but they don't eat pork. And that is part of what makes them Hebrew. Does that make sense? By observing that, they maintain their heritage. By only marrying other Hebrews that they can trace, they are maintaining Hebrew heritage. And by following the rules, the laws that God specifically gives to them, they are able to maintain who they are. You know, don't marry outside your clan. It's not just because you may waver off, it's because you're now polluting God's pure people of who God says this is who it needs to be. Now, when Jesus arrives, things are starting to change. And as you'll know, we've got a couple of verses to where Jesus says, you know, hey, I didn't come to abolish the laws. I came to enhance them, to help explain them even a bit more. And this is what is about to begin to happen here in Mark chapter 7.
Hey, question.
Yeah.
You said to polluting the pure people. It's really about polluting their faith, right? The idolatry. It's not purely, oh, everybody else is bad. Y'all are some Aryan race. It's
yes,
that pollution of idolatry and other gods.
Yes, it is. But I think where I don't know that every ancient Hebrew would say this is to protect my faith, whereas they might say this is to protect my family tradition.
Sure. But if we look at it with a lens from the New Testament, or a lens looking backwards of seeing Jesus. Because I think sometimes when we see all those things, we think, oh, God's being so mean. Oh, he only likes these kinds of people. But
right.
But we have that advantage that we can make that statement. Oh, don't do that because we see what happens when they intermarry before Jesus. That's when they fall into idolatry.
Sure. And we have lots of hindsight. But one of the things that's really interesting is things are about to shift. Things are about to change in this story, in this chapter. So let's keep going in this. So they say, why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but they eat with defiled hands? So this is verse 6 in chapter 7. And Jesus said to them, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, the people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition. And so what he's saying you're taking this tradition of the elders of washing hands before you eat, which was a privilege originally offered to the people, and you're raising it to the standard of it is now a moral sin if they do not wash their hands before they eat. That's what he's calling them out on. So look at verse 9. He'll continue on this. Then he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. For Moses said, now he's talking about something different here. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever speaks evil of father or mother must surely die. But you say, and he's talking to the elders, you say that if anyone tells father or mother, quote, whatever support you might have had from me is Corban, that is an offering to God, then you no longer permit anything for the father and mother. So here's the issue, is that part of being Hebrew is that children support their parents. Unlike the way we do, where we always pay for our children. Children are supposed to financially support their parents. But there is in the Old Testament, throughout the Old Testament, there is a law called Corban. And Corban is when you give a offering to God, you announce it. I am providing my offering to the temple. And that once you say that, you are obligated to give that to the temple, even if somebody else needs it. Does that make sense? That's the rule. Okay. And so what he's saying that, listen, y'all say that you're supposed to honor your father and mother, but as soon as a rich kid comes in, and says, I'm going to give a big church donation, their parents may be starving. And you say that they cannot give that to their parents, when their obligation is not to the church, their obligation is to their parents or those in need. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay. And here's what had happened. Two different things had happened. First thing is, you have somebody coming in saying, I am going to give all of my money to the church, and they're not going to support their family. Okay. And then they don't give it to the church. Okay. There's one abuse, right?
Yeah.
If you say you're going to give to the church and then you don't, so
Mhm.
it's like, okay, I know there's needs within my own immediate group. I'm not going to give it to them. I'm going to tell them that I give it to the church, because if I tell them I give it to the church, then then I'm out of it with my family. I don't have to worry about taking care of my family.
Mhm.
And then I can keep it for myself. Or I might announce a big $10,000 gift, and I'll actually only give 5,000. That way I can keep 5,000 for myself. So there's one set of problems. Then there's a whole other set of problems, which would be a priest who has got a big construction project going on and running a capital campaign. Okay. And he says, don't worry about supporting your family. Give all your money to the church, because we need to get restrooms in here in this building.
Mhm.
Okay. And so you come in here and you announce it as Corbin, and therefore I, as the priest, I, as the church elder, can direct funds that would be used normally to support your family to me. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay. That's what Jesus is talking about. That's what he's talking about in these verses, is that Corbin, which has perfectly legitimate reasons to have installed that, is being abused in a number of ways, plus all the other ways we haven't come up with, but that's just two ways that we can call right there. So verse 12.
Where did the children get the money?
Well, apparently they make it on their own, you know. I think, I don't know, I'm still waiting on that, but but hopefully that, I don't know, yeah, I just like to pay their own phone bill. That'd be nice. But okay. So verse 12, then you no longer permit doing anything for father or mother, thus making void the word of God through your tradition that you have handed on, and you do many things like this. Because what? A commandment: honor your father and mother. And how do you honor your father and mother? You take care of them. And that includes financially if and when they need it. That's part of the commandment, the original 10. So verse 14. Then he called the crowd again and said to them, listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside of a person that by going in can defile, but it is the things that come out that defile. So this has got a lot of really, really deep meaning to it. And if we sort of think about what it means, is, or let's think about theoretically, because he's going to go into some detail here in just a second, but theoretically, you can do almost anything that you want. Let's just blanket it with something like that, unless the actions that come out of you because of what you did harm other people, harm your relationship with God. So in other words, let's take alcohol. You can drink alcohol unless it makes you a drunken buffoon, unless you beat your spouse, unless you become terrible to your children, unless you become a silly fool. Because if taking a drink causes you to be a silly fool, and somebody on the street who does not go to church sees you being a silly fool, you have just, does that make sense? So in theory, that's what he's talking about, It's not about what comes in, it's about how it comes out after we've put it inside. So watch, and he goes into detail about this. Verse 17. When he had left the crowd, and keep in mind, by the way, he had given this speech and they still didn't understand. So he called in verse 14, he called everybody together and told them again. And now he's going to take them inside the house because the disciples still don't understand what he's talking about. So if you're lost, don't worry. So is everybody else. Okay. So when he had left the crowd and he entered the house, we think this is probably Peter's house in Capernaum, verse 17. His disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, then do you also fail to understand? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and then goes out through the sewer? So he takes a very dramatic and graphic, don't you know what you eat is going to end up on the pot anyway, and in the sewer heading out of the city, right? That's not what messes up your heart. Now he's not talking about cholesterol and all these things that we know about. He's talking about moral fiber. He's talking about I think whatever it is that we could eat that could offend somebody else if we're in that environment. So if we're in those far off places, for instance, and we're trying to enjoy their meal, part of what we're thinking about when we sit down is that we are trying to observe whatever rules they normally observe, right? Because we don't want to offend them. We don't, by doing something wrong, or we're very careful about that. We don't want to create a problem. If us having a drink is okay for us, but creates a severe problem with somebody we are eating with, let's say real wine or grape juice at communion. Let's take it that way. Okay. Do we do wine at communion or not? And churches are all kind of all over the board with this. And so it is my opinion, and having known as many alcoholics as I have, that even a little bitty sip of wine at communion is enough to throw an alcoholic over the edge. Okay. And so because of that, I remove it for everybody when I serve communion. We don't even mess with it, because I don't want somebody to not come to the table because they are afraid to even have bread dumped in. Does that make sense? Because even the smallest amount can create a problem. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that if I go to a big dinner party and I want to take bacon crusted green beans because they're my favorite, that I have to be worried about who doesn't eat pork. I'm at a huge dinner party and there's probably lots of things that are there. But if I am inviting some Hebrew friends over for dinner, I probably do not need to be serving my bacon encrusted green beans. That's just not cool. I'm putting them on the spot, right? Now, if you don't know, that's ignorance. That's a whole different. Jesus is not talking about that. Jesus is talking about if you know it's a problem that could cause harm to another individual, you got to think about that. If you know it causes damage to you to do this, drugs, alcohol, whatever's, throw in anything you want. If you know that it causes you a problem, then it's a problem. Then don't do it. It's not because you're taking it in, it's because the way that it comes back out, right? It's the way that we react to it. If our problem is, if we need to lose a few pounds, if I need to lose a few pounds, I don't need to eat a large pepperoni pizza tonight. That's just not That just doesn't make sense. Now I am allowed to splurge, and I will give myself permission to splurge whenever I want, but it doesn't come out the proper way. And we can take any sin and throw it into that same category. It may be a sin for some where it's not, well, or we consider it a sin for some, where for some others it's not. Alcohol is not a problem for some people. And I told the story in the early class that when I came down here for interviews to Longboat Key, I was taking a tour through the church. I went through the kitchen and I opened up the pantry door, and inside the pantry were stacked cases of wine. Because I didn't know what kind of place I was coming to, and so I was okay. Well, I know I can expect that there is probably alcohol at these functions, right? Does that make sense? And so what Jesus is saying is he's trying to help them understand it's not about what goes in, it's about how we react to it when it's coming out. And if it comes out as anger or any other issue, then it's a problem and we need to be considerate of it. So watch how he continues it. Verse 19, since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and then goes out through the sewer. Here's our old friend Mark. Look in verse 19. Thus he declared all foods clean. Okay. Is that Jesus declaring all foods clean? No. Absolutely no. And it's an emphatic no. Jesus is not declaring all foods clean. Okay. The thing, it's not about what's clean for you and a clean for everybody. To be Hebrew, don't eat pork. That doesn't mean it doesn't give you the excuse that you could, okay, I am gluten free. And so that means I can order any kind of bread I want and eat it. No. Jesus says that bread is okay to eat. But if it's bad for me, don't eat it. Allergic to peanuts, don't eat Kung Pao chicken. Don't eat it. It's got peanuts in it. Okay, right? Is it a sin to eat peanuts? No. Are you being sinful eating peanuts? No, but you're going to pay for it. Does that make sense? And so this is the second place in this chapter where we know for a fact that this is not the case. Jesus is not saying that all foods are clean. It's not about that. You can eat what you want, but if it takes away from who God made you to be, and if you're Hebrew, be Hebrew. If you're Swedish, be Swedish. If you're Arkansan, be Arkansan. Be who you're to be, but don't create sins for other people or create barriers for other people. You can see how he continues it. And then he said, it is what comes out of a person that defiles, verse 21. For it is from within the human heart that evil intentions come. Fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. 12 of them. We get 12 sins right there. And all these evil things come from within. And that's what the problem is. It's not about the food. Does that make sense?
Right.
So I talked about in the earlier class, if to my opinion, Hebrews are the chosen people. You've already got like an advantage over everybody, at least in my opinion. If you're Hebrew, if Jesus is your Messiah, accept Jesus as your Messiah, but stay Hebrew. Be Hebrew. Be who you get like a double dose. You are like guaranteed. Okay, you're like for sure in. Sometimes I'll have Catholics that'll come and say, I want to join the church. Well, that's great and that's wonderful. But I promise you, I am not going to un-Catholic you. I am not going to send a letter to your priest or to your parish saying that your membership is transferred. And I'm going to do that for several reasons. Number one, if you want to become Catholic again, you got to go all the way back through catechism. And I ain't putting that on anybody, right? but something made you who you are. And if being Catholic is who made you, be Catholic. It's okay. You don't have to just choose one or the other. God doesn't force us to choose one brand versus another, but be who you are called to be. And if you want to go to the chapel and yet you still want to go to St. Mary's Star of the Sea and say confessions to Father Robert, I think that is absolutely wonderful and beautiful. Go right on ahead. I don't want to hear your confessions. Don't tell them to me, but just go right on to Father Robert and do it. And I think that's absolutely beautiful. But the last thing that I would want to do would be to uncreate who has created you. Now, if it's unhealthy, that's one thing, but this is not, we're not talking about things that are unhealthy. We're talking about things that are good and strong and powerful and godly. Being Hebrew or being Catholic or being vegetarian if you're a vegetarian. You know, if we want to do it right. So gluten-free is a good one because in communion at the chapel, we have gluten-free wafers because lots of people are gluten-free. And we also have white grape juice because a very popular diagnosis among children today is red dye number 5. And you go to the doctor and the doctor says, your kid is now allergic to red dye number 5. Well, like everything that you eat that's red has red dye number 5 in it, just about. Every popsicle, every sucker, every lifesaver, and for sure, Welch's grape juice has red dye number 5 in it. So we use white grape juice. And basically what that's trying to do is Brock's trying his best to remove most of the allergens that would prohibit people from being able to receive communion. That might be, some people might say that's going a little overboard, but to me, that's just part of being an open table. If you wish to receive, come on and get it. You can have gluten-free or not. You can have Italian bread with grape juice or with white grape, any way you want it, but come on, and it's okay. Because it's not about what's going in, it's about how we use it coming out. Okay. Questions on any and all of that stuff. So that's tradition. That's the first 23 verses. There's a lot in there. And I'm guessing this is probably stuff you skipped over because it is kind of difficult reading if you don't really break it down and kind of spend some time with the context in which Jesus is he's teaching. And of course, and he's you know, he's doing his best to help everybody understand what the difference is. Anything? Yes, Judy.
So I never realized they were talking about food. When I read this, I thought it was kind of like an analogy, and I read it like it's not what goes into a person. So like you could sit in church every Sunday, you can tithe, you can read the Bible, you can do everything God asks of you. But then when you go and pass the stranger on the street and be like, you lazy lop, why don't you get a job? That's what defiles the things that come out of your heart. So I guess I missed the mark on all that because I was thinking it was more about, you know, don't say you're Christ-like and you're a Christian and go through all the motions, but then, you know, your actions speak louder than words, because then if you treat, you know, your neighbor unkind, what's all done for you? But that, I guess that wasn't.
No, I think you're right, Judy. I think that it's about all of those things. The context in which he is discussing, or the example that he's using, is food, because food really is an easy one to understand. We eat it, and then it's going to come right back out. Like, I don't know if you've ever thought about this way. I'm cheap, so sometimes I do. I was like, okay, I'm hungry tonight, so I can go spend $20 and go buy it over there, or I can eat it here and be full both times, and yet it's all going to go to the same darn place. And so I fight with myself. Okay, do I save the $20? You know, because in an hour it's not going to matter anyway. And so I think from that standpoint, I think food's an easy illustration, but I think you're exactly right. It's not just sitting in church on the Sabbath, on the Saturday or Friday, or going to Friday night mass or Sunday or whatever, and soaking it all up and then being a hellion the rest of the week, because that's not. I think Jesus is talking about that just as much as anything else. We can go to Bible study. We can pretend that we're doing everything right, but what happens later? And I know that typical, I should say that it's the expression that comes out. That's the evil that Jesus is trying to hone in on. And specifically with these elders, they were trying to discredit the disciples and basically show these people are sinners because they don't wash their hands.
Yeah.
And that means that they have a moral disagreement. They have a severe problem with God, or God has a severe problem with them, and that is not what happened. That's not at all what happened, because it's not a sin if you don't wash your hands. We know if you don't wash your hands, it's not very smart. Okay. But it's not at least according in this context, it's not a sin. Now, post COVID, I think I could argue that a little bit, because if washing my hands helps protect somebody else, that's a good thing. And if I intentionally don't wash my hands and subject somebody else, like if I'm sick, I don't need to be going to visit somebody in the hospital, right? I mean, that doesn't make sense. I mean, even though that might be part of me and Jeffrey's job, if we're not feeling well, the last thing we need to be doing is potentially spreading, when we know good and well that's not what we're supposed to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, even though we have a commitment to what we do, and we have a pull and an urge, and I know this, it's about being, sometimes it's about being smart.
Yeah.
So, other questions on this? So yeah, Judy, I think you're right on. I think this we're supposed to use this as a metaphor across the board. I think food is just an easy one because it was started with the hand washing, but it's everybody understands what it means to eat and stuff. So, are there thoughts or questions on any of this? So, I've been able to make this whole 23 verses go a full hour, which is wonderful. Because I'm going to be preaching on this on Sunday, and I'll be able to, the next two passages, the next one is the Syrophoenician woman's faith. And if y'all like, we can touch on that real quick. That's verse 24, because it also, there's a little more to it. Let's look at that real quick. I think we can do it in 5 minutes. From there, he sent out and he went away to the region of Tyre. And Tyre is a Greek city on the coast that is some distance away. It doesn't look like he's taking anybody with him. So he's probably trying to sneak away by himself for a little alone time. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. And why could he not escape notice? Well, if Tyre is one of the Decapolis, one of the 10 Greek city-states. Last week's lesson, we talked about the Decapolis, where there was a man who lived in the tombs and around the caves, and he was a demon-possessed guy. And it was in the Greek. That was when he sent the spirit into the pigs. You know, the pigs ran off the cliff. It's that story. That was last week's, and you can look at that online if you want. But after he was healed, Scripture says he ran all over the Decapolis talking about Jesus, spreading the good news of Jesus. And so one of the things that we look at is like, here we are in a far away town early in the gospel, how do these people even know who Jesus is? Well, it's possible the demon-possessed man has already been there and has already said if Jesus is trying to hide out. So let's look at verse 25. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and she bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, that means she's not Jewish, of Syro-Phoenician origin, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And Jesus said to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. So this is an insulting statement, no matter who you are or from where you are. He's saying, don't bother me. I got better things to do than to mess with you. And she says, verse 28, but she answered him, sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And then he said to her, for saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. So she went home and she found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. So this has got some important theological reference for a couple of things. So first of all, in that point in time, your people are already keeping dogs as pets. And just like dogs are under, when a high chair shows up, that's a dog's best friend, right? When the high chair shows up, the dog knows they're going to be eating plenty and eating good stuff. And so they're under our table, just like they're under their table. And she comes and she says, I need a miracle. I need you to heal my daughter. And Jesus says, let the children be fed first. The children that he's talking about are
The Hebrews.
the Hebrews.
Oh, I never understood that verse.
His mission is to come and save the Hebrew nation first.
Yes.
And a very common insult that Hebrews used to use against non-Hebrews would be to call people dogs. So Hebrews would use dogs as a derogatory term referring to other people. And she says, but yes, but even when the baby in the high chair is fed, the dog is still eating. And so from a kind of a theological standpoint, kind of overarching, this kind of begins where we really start seeing that non-Hebrews are not only included, but they are given every opportunity as well. Now, Jesus is clear the Hebrews are first, but there is plenty of food to feed the dogs as well, to feed anybody and everybody else.
This is mind blowing. I never understood these verses. I'm like, oh my gosh, now it all makes sense.
Yeah, so it's a great and beautiful, beautiful story. And in the Gospel of Mark, it'll all fit together as we continue to move along. We'll see more and more and more of this. And so I hope that you join us next week. We're going to be talking about chapter 8. I'm not going to talk about the next miracle because I have to preach on something on Sunday. And so I'll be able to use that on Sunday. But next week is Mark chapter 8, and we'll do the same thing as we did today. We'll go through it slowly, and I hope that y'all feel like you can ask questions because I really want you to. Any questions on what we've covered tonight in chapter 7? Anything? We're basically going to do a chapter a week. So if you fall behind, that's fine. Everything is recorded, and I'm still recording this session. It's on our YouTube page. And again, the easiest way to get there is to go to our newsletter, the Chapel Line, and you'll see a button that says click this to go to last week's thing. And then when you click on it, you're going to be able to see after today, you're going to be able to see week 1, 2, and 3, and they'll all be right there. And so it takes a little bit. This will probably not be uploaded until tomorrow morning. But it'll be there for you, and so that you can watch all 3 of them, and hopefully that's helpful.
Very helpful. I like that.
Oh, good, excellent.
Good.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thanks all of y'all. Thank you for hanging out and coming to see us, and hope to see you again next week. 5:30 p.m. Eastern time. I'll start it up a little bit earlier. So if y'all want to chit chat, you can. But if y'all want to stay on, you can. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording.